The night my stepmother told us to leave, the garden was in full bloom. I remember that detail more than anything else. The way the tomato plants stood heavy and green along the fence, the squash sprawling fat and yellow across the beds, the beans climbing their poles like they were reaching for something they hadn't found yet. My grandmother had planted that garden. Her hands had turned every inch of that soil. And now, a woman who had never grown anything in her life was standing on the porch pointing toward the road, telling me and my brother to walk down it and not come back. I was 14 years old. My brother Callo was 11. "You're old enough to figure things out," Renata said. Her voice carried the flat, businesslike tone of someone reading from a script they'd rehearsed. She didn't look at us when she spoke. She looked at the middle distance, somewhere between our faces and the tree line, where things were easier to see. "There's a shelter in town. The church on Pelham Street takes in minors." Callo's hand found mine in the fading light. His fingers were warm, tighter than they needed to be. Our grandmother, Vera Calloway, had been dead for 4 months. She had died in February in the same farmhouse where she'd been born 81 years earlier, in a bedroom that smelled like dried lavender and old wood, surrounded by the quilts she'd made herself during long winter evenings when the snow came down so hard you couldn't see the barn from the kitchen window. She had died quietly, which was the only quiet thing about her, because everything else about Grandma Vera was noise. Her laugh, her opinions, her insistence that a meal wasn't a meal without something you'd grown yourself. Our father had died 2 years before that. He had been Vera's son, a man who drove a logging truck and came home every night smelling like pine resin and cold air, who made pancakes on Sunday mornings and read to us at bedtime until we were too old to admit we still wanted him to. The cancer had taken him in 6 months. After that, Grandma Vera had taken us in. After Grandma Vera died, her house went to Renata. Nobody had explained to me how that worked, the legal mechanics of it, who had signed what, who had agreed to what. But I understood the result clearly enough as I stood in the driveway with a backpack on my shoulders and my brother's hand in mine, watching a woman who had been married to our uncle for less than 2 years tell us that we were no longer welcome in a house where we had lived for most of our lives. "Where are we going?" Callo asked. I didn't have an answer, but I had something else. I had a key. Grandma Vera had given it to me the week before she died. Not the key to the house. The other key, the small brass one on the leather cord that she always wore around her neck and that I had never seen her take off, not even in summer when she complained the cord made her neck sweat. She had lifted it over her head with both hands and settled it around mine, pressing the key against my sternum with her palm. "You'll know when," she said. Her voice was still clear even then, even when the rest of her was fading. "When there's nowhere else, when you need solid ground, you'll know when." "Know what, Grandma?" She had smiled, the kind of smile that holds more than it shows. "What I left for you, what I've been tending for 40 years, waiting for someone to need it." I had carried that key for 4 months. I had worn it under my shirt during the awkward weeks after the funeral, when Renata moved her boxes in and her personality took over every room like furniture rearranged in the night. I had worn it while I cooked dinner she didn't thank us for, and cleaned floors she didn't notice, and watched my grandmother's house become a place I no longer recognized. Now, standing in the dark with nowhere to go, I finally understood what she had meant. I knew where we were going. The root cellar was at the back of the property, through the apple orchard that Renata had already decided was too much work to maintain, past the old fence line where the cultivated ground gave way to the rough meadow grass, tucked into the base of the hill like something the land had grown there on purpose. Grandma Vera had never talked about it much. It was just always there, a low stone facade built into the slope, a wooden door that she kept padlocked, the kind of place you stopped noticing because it had always been there. When I was small, I had asked her what was inside. "Everything worth keeping," she had said, and left it at that. I found it by flashlight, Callo walking close behind me, his sneakers wet from the long grass. The padlock was brass, old, the same dull gold as the key around my neck. When I pressed the key in and turned it, the lock opened with sound that felt like a word I didn't have a name for. I pulled the door open. The smell that came out was cool and complex. Earth, wood, dried herbs, something sweet underneath it all, like old apples. Callo pressed close to my shoulder as my flashlight beam swept across the interior. It was larger than I had expected. Much larger. The front section was what you'd expect from any root cellar. Stone walls, wooden shelving, the remains of last year's store still resting in wooden crates. Jars of preserved vegetables, their lids sealed with wax. Potatoes in sand-filled bins. Dried herbs bundled and hanging from the ceiling beams in fragrant rows. But behind the shelving, deeper in, the space opened up. Someone had built rooms down here. Not fancy rooms. Not finished rooms with plaster walls and electric lights. But real rooms nonetheless, framed with timber, floor with fitted stone, the ceilings low but solid. 3 of them, arranged along a central passage that ran back into the hillside 20 feet or more. The stone walls were dry, insulated by the earth pressing in from all sides. And there, on a shelf in the first room, next to a lantern and a box of long matches, was an envelope. My name was on it, written in Grandma Vera's careful, looping handwriting. I read it sitting on the stone floor with Callo pressed against my side and the lantern casting warm shadows across the walls. My darling Maren, if you are reading this, then something has gone wrong in a way that things sometimes go wrong when we are not there to prevent them. I am sorry I could not be there. I am sorry for a great many things, but especially for that. This cellar was built by my mother's father in 1934, during the Depression, when the family had nothing but this land and the things they could grow from it. He built it to last, and it has. I have been tending it since your father was a boy, adding to it, strengthening it, keeping it ready. Ready for what, you might ask? Ready for whoever needed it. The structure is sound. The walls are 3 feet of fitted stone. The temperature stays between 50 and 58 degrees year-round. There's a hand pump in the back room connected to an underground spring that has never gone dry in 90 years. There's enough preserved food on those shelves to last a careful family through a full winter. But more than that, Maren, there is soil. Half an acre of the field above the cellar has been prepared for 40 years. I have been composting it, amending it, building it up in secret, because I believe that someday someone would need it. The soil test results are in the red folder on the second shelf. The seed stock is in the sealed tin beside it. I built you a foundation. What you build on top of it is yours. All my love, Grandma Vera. P.S. The Hendersons next door have always been good people. Milo Henderson will help you if you ask him. Tell him Vera sent you. That first night, we slept on the stone floor on a pile of old quilts we found folded in one of the back rooms. Grandma Vera's quilts, the same ones from her bedroom, which meant she had moved them here herself, deliberately, in the weeks before she died. She had known, and she had prepared. Callo fell asleep quickly, his breathing slowing into something deep and even. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the silence of the hillside, the faint creak of the timber framing, the distant sound of wind that couldn't reach us down here. I made a list in my head. Water, the hand pump. Test it in the morning. Food, the preserved stores. Inventory tomorrow. Heat, find or build something for winter. Figure out ventilation. Light, the lantern. Need more fuel or better, solar. The field, Grandma said it was ready. Find out what that means. I was 14 years old, making survival plans in an underground room my great-great-grandfather had built during the worst economic crisis in American history. I thought about Grandma Vera's hands. How they always smelled like earth and green things. How she could look at a patch of dirt and tell you what it needed the way some people can look at a person's face and know how they're feeling. How she had tried to teach me, and I had only half paid attention because I was a kid and kids believe they have time. I didn't have time anymore, but I had what she'd left me. I closed my eyes and went to sleep. The hand pump worked. I discovered this at 6 in the morning. Callo, still asleep, after 20 minutes of stiff, protesting resistance from a mechanism that hadn't been used in months. Then something gave way, the water flowed, cold, clean, completely clear, and I sat back on my heels and felt the first real thing I had felt in days. Relief. The shelves yielded their inventory gradually as I cataloged them by lantern light. 83 quart jars of preserved tomatoes, beans, pickles, corn, and beets. 14 half-gallon jars of fruit preserves. 30 pounds of dried beans in sealed containers. 20 pounds of rice. Salt, sugar, vinegar, dried herbs in labeled paper envelopes. Enough calories, if carefully rationed, to sustain 2 people for the better part of a year. Grandma Vera had not been preparing for a minor inconvenience. She had been preparing for exactly this. The red folder was where she said it would be. The soil test results inside were dated 3 years earlier, annotated in her handwriting. The field above, 1/2 acre, bordered by the old fence and the apple orchard, registered nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium levels that made my eyes go wide even though I had only a teenager's understanding of what those numbers meant. Excellent. The lab had written the notes. Exceptional organic matter content. Ready for intensive production. The seed tin held paper envelopes, each one labeled in Vera's hand. Tomatoes for varieties. Beans, 3. Squash, cucumber, corn, carrots, beets, kale, chard, onions, garlic, potatoes. Herbs, basil, thyme, rosemary, parsley. Flower seeds for pollinators. Everything a serious gardener would put in the ground in a serious attempt to feed people. I held the tin in my lap for a long time. Then I put on my shoes and went to find Milo Henderson. He was exactly where you'd expect to find a 73-year-old farmer at 7 in the morning, in his barn, moving with the deliberate efficiency of someone who had performed the same tasks so many thousand times they had become a kind of prayer. He heard me coming and turned before I spoke. His eyes were pale blue, the color of winter sky, set in a face that looked like it had been carved from the same wood as his fence posts. "You're Vera's girl," he said. "Not a question. Her granddaughter, Maren Calloway." He nodded slowly, studying me. "She told me about you, said you had her stubbornness." Something shifted in his expression. "She passed you the key?" "Yes, sir." He was quiet for a moment. Then he took off his hat and held it in both hands the way men do when they're about to say something that matters to them. "She was a fine woman, finest neighbor I ever had. She said you'd help us." She was right. He put his hat back on. "What do you need?" What I needed was more than I knew how to ask for, so I started with what was most urgent and let the rest follow. Milo had a spare propane camp stove he wasn't using, a box of LED lanterns from some emergency preparedness kit he'd bought after a bad ice storm 5 years back, and enough scrap lumber in his barn to build a basic raised platform bed. He drove these things over in his pickup that same afternoon, back down the trail to the cellar entrance, and helped me carry them in without once suggesting that what we were doing was unusual. Callo, who had spent the morning arranging preserved food by category with the focused energy of a child who needs to feel useful, looked up when Milo came through the door. He stared at the old man for a moment. Then he said, "Are you going to help?" "Appears so," Milo said. "Good," Callo said, and went back to his sorting. Milo almost smiled. I caught at the corner of his mouth before it disappeared back into the weather-worn lines of his face. Over the next 2 weeks, he came every other day. He never stayed more than a few hours, and he never made us feel like charity cases, which I understood only later was a deliberate choice on his part, a form of respect that cost him something. He showed me how to check the ceiling timbers for soft spots. He helped me reseal the door frame with weather stripping. He brought over 2 rain barrels and showed me how to position them at the cellar's drainage point, so that runoff from the hill above would fill them naturally. And one morning, standing in the field above the cellar with the spring sun finally warm enough to mean something, he looked at the 1/2 acre of prepared ground and said, "Your grandmother worked this soil for a long time. I know. You can plant it?" "That's the plan." He turned to look at me with those winter sky eyes. "You know how?" "I'm going to learn." He studied me for another moment. Then he nodded once, the way people do when they've decided something. "Come to my place Saturday morning. I'll show you what I know." The planting took 3 weeks in April and into May. Milo taught me how to read the soil, how to dig a handful and feel it, smell it, understand what it was telling you about what it needed. He taught me row spacing and companion planting, which plants helped each other and which competed, how to direct sow versus transplant, when to thin and when to let things grow thick for ground cover. Callo became my field assistant with the total commitment he brought to everything, which meant he was obsessive about it, keeping a planting journal with dates and locations, and his own notes about what the seedlings looked like day by day. At 11 years old, He developed opinions about soil moisture that he expressed with an authority that would have been funny if he hadn't been mostly right. We were not invisible. I understood that. People in the county knew we were living in Vera Calloway's root cellar. Word travels in small communities away whether it travels across open fields, fast, changing shape as it moves, arriving at your door as something different from what it started as. What reached me, filtered through Milo's careful reports and the occasional overheard conversation in town when I came in for supplies, was a mixture of pity, amusement, and a particular skepticism that small towns reserve for people who do things differently. Heard some kids are living in the ground like groundhogs, someone said at the feed store one afternoon in May. A woman's voice, carrying that cheerful contempt people use when they're talking about someone else's misfortune. I bought my seeds and left. The amusement bothered me less than the pity. Pity implied a fixed position, someone looking down, someone stuck below. We weren't stuck. Every day we were building something, and the thing we were building was getting larger. By June, the field was green. I am not sure I have words for what it felt like to stand at the edge of that half-acre and look at the rows of plants that had come out of the ground, because we had put them there, tomato seedlings in their cages, already knee-high, bean plants climbing their strings in long green curtains, squash sprawling between the rows in the way squash does, taking up more space than you planned for, daring you to complain, corn rising in its block, tassels just beginning to show. Grandma Vera had prepared this soil for 40 years. We had planted it, and it was answering. Renata came in July. I saw the car coming down the road from the field, recognized the silver sedan from the months we'd spent under a roof, and felt something tighten in my chest that I recognized as a particular dread of unfinished business. She parked at the edge of property line, the old fence that marked where Vera's land ended and the meadow began, and got out. She was wearing clothes that were wrong for the season, too formal, as if she had dressed to make an impression and hadn't thought about the heat. She looked at the field, at the green rows, the caged tomatoes, the corn standing 8 feet tall in its block. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she looked at me. "This is private property," she said. "This half-acre was deeded separately," I said. Milo Henderson helped me check. "It's in the original land survey. The root cellar and the north field were excluded from the main property transfer." I pulled the folded paper from my pocket. A copy Milo had helped me get from the county recorder's office 3 weeks earlier, because I had been expecting this visit and I had prepared for it. It belonged to my grandmother outright, and she left it to me. I had asked Milo to explain the legal situation to me 3 times until I understood it completely. Grandma Vera had been meticulous. The north field and the cellar structure had been in a separate parcel since her parents' time, never combined with the main farmhouse property. The deed transfer to Renata had not included it, which meant it passed by the terms of Vera's informal will, handwritten, witnessed by Milo himself, and signed the winter before she died, directly to me. Renata stared at the paper. Then she looked at the field again. "Your children," she said, "were Vera Calloway's grandchildren." I said, "This is what she left us. We're using it." She stood there for another moment, and I watched something move through her face that I couldn't fully read. Frustration, maybe, or something closer to discomfort. Then she got back in her car and drove away. My hands were shaking, I realized. I pressed them flat against my thighs until they stopped. From the field behind me, Callo's voice, "Is she gone?" "She's gone." A pause. Then, "Good. The west corner beans need tying." I laughed. It came out louder than I expected, released from somewhere deep, and I stood in the July sun laughing until the shaking stopped completely. The drought started in August. It didn't announce itself. That's the thing about drought. It arrives by subtraction, not addition. 1 day without rain, then 3, then 10, then 20. The sky stays clear and the sun stays merciless, and the soil that was dark and rich begins to develop a pale, powdery surface layer that tells you something is changing. The county had not had a significant rainfall event in 6 weeks by the 3rd week of August. The creeks were down. The reservoir outside town was at 53%. The forecasts were cautious, using words like prolonged and concerning and potentially historic. Farmers were worried. Their fields were corn and soybeans, mostly monocrop operations that had been planted and fertilized and managed with chemical inputs and machinery, and that were now showing the stress in curl leaves and shortened plants, and particular dusty pallor crops that are spending more energy on survival than on production. Our field was not showing that stress. Milo was the first to notice, standing at the fence line one afternoon in late August with his hat pushed back on his head and his pale eyes moving slowly across our rows. "Your plants look different," he said. "The soil holds water," I told him. "Grandma's composting. The organic matter. It acts like a sponge." Milo had taught me this himself in one of our Saturday morning sessions. Deep organic content holds moisture at the root zone even when the surface dries out. He was quiet for a moment. "The Henderson East field is down 30%. I'm sorry. My corn is worse." He looked at me. "Your beans look like it rained last week." It didn't. He nodded slowly, looked at the field, then back at me, then at the field again. "Vera knew," he said softly. "She always said the soil was different. I thought she was just being sentimental. She was building something." I said. "She just didn't know who would need it." September came, and the harvest began. I want to describe it accurately because I think it deserves accuracy. It was not a miracle. It was not magic. It was a result of 40 years of deliberate soil preparation, careful seed selection, and a particular agricultural wisdom that comes from paying close attention to a piece of ground for longer than most people stay in one place. But the results were, by any practical measure, extraordinary. The tomatoes came in by the bushel, for varieties staggered in their ripening, so that as the early varieties finished, the mid-season ones were just hitting their peak, and as those faded, the late-season plants were still producing steadily into the cool September nights. We picked 500 pounds of tomatoes off that half-acre. The beans were heavy. The corn, planted in its block, pollinated densely, sheltered from the wind by its own mass, came in full and sweet even in the drought. The squash had sprawled and spread and produced gourds the size of small children. The potatoes, when I put my fork in the ground and began to lift, came up in clusters so dense I kept stopping to count them. By the second week of September, I had a problem I had not anticipated. We had more food than two people could eat, preserve, or store. Far more. Milo was the one who suggested the farmer's market, which ran on Saturday mornings in the parking lot of the county extension office. He said it simply, practically, the way he said everything. "You've got product. There are buyers. That's how it works." I was not sure we would be welcome. I was 14 years old. My brother was 11, and we had spent the summer being the subject of other people's amusement. The farmers who set up their tables every Saturday were adults with decades of experience, their own land, their own equipment. I was a child who had been living in a root cellar since April. But Milo drove us on the first Saturday, and he set up his own table beside ours, and when the other vendors looked at us with a particular expression of people trying to figure out where to file this information, he looked back at them with his winter sky eyes until they went back to their own business. The first customer stopped at our table at 7:15 in the morning, before we'd finished arranging the display. She was 60-something, wearing a garden hat, with the hands of someone who grew things. She picked up a tomato, a Brandywine, deep red, heavy for its size, and held it the way Milo had taught me to hold them, feeling the weight, checking the stem end. "Where'd you grow these?" she asked. "North field off Calloway Road," I said. "The old Vera Calloway property." The woman looked up. Something moved across her face. "You're Vera's people?" "Her granddaughter." She put down the tomato and looked at our table, the full baskets, the variety, the produce that had come through a drought that was devastating fields across the county. Then she looked at me. "I'll take 2 pounds of Brandywines," she said, "and tell me what else you've got." We sold out in 90 minutes. Word spread the way it always does, faster than you want it to when you're not ready. But this time it was a different kind of word, not the groundhog remarks, not the pity. Something else was moving through the county now, something that travels when people are worried, and something unexpected offers itself as an answer. The drought was now officially in its 9th week. The county extension office had issued an advisory. Several large farming operations were projecting losses of 40% or more. The grocery co-op in town had sent a notice to its members about anticipated supply chain impacts on locally sourced produce. And a 14-year-old girl from a root cellar on Calloway Road was bringing full baskets of tomatoes to the Saturday market. The second Saturday, twice as many people came to our table. The third Saturday, there was a line before we finished unloading. The county extension agent, a woman named Darlene Marsh, who wore her expertise lightly and her concern for the region's food supply visibly, came to find us on the fourth Saturday. She was in her 40s, with short gray hair and the particular alertness of someone who is always processing information. She stood at our table for a while, looking at the produce without buying anything, which I recognized as a professional assessment rather than casual browsing. "Your soil test," she said finally. "Can I see it?" I pulled out my copy. I had started carrying it, along with Vera's letter and the property deed, in a folder that lived in my backpack. Darlene took it and read it carefully, the way Milo read things, with full attention. "This is 40 years of organic amendment," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Your grandmother did this herself?" "Every year. She kept records." Darlene looked up. "Do you have the records?" I did. Vera's garden journals, 37 of them, filled with her careful handwriting. What she'd added to the soil each season, what she planted and where, what had worked and what hadn't, observations about the weather, the water table, the behavior of her plants through drought years and wet years and years that were just ordinary years. I had found them in the back room of the cellar, stacked on a shelf in chronological order, as if she had known someone would need to read them. Darlene Marsh sat at our folding table for 40 minutes, reading Vera's journals while the market moved around her. When she finally looked up, her expression had shifted into something I hadn't seen on an adult's face directed at me before. Not pity, not amusement, something closer to respect. "Would you be willing to let me bring some people to see your field?" she asked. "What kind of people?" "Other farmers. People who are trying to understand why some soil survives drought and some doesn't." She paused. "People who might need to know how to build what your grandmother built." I thought about Vera's letter. Use it to help others. That is what it was always meant for. "Yes," I said. "Bring them." October came in cold and clear, the drought finally breaking in the second week with 3 days of steady rain that felt like the county exhaling after holding its breath all summer. By then, Darlene had brought 2 groups of farmers to field, 12 people in total, standing in the rows between the late-season kale and the storage squash and the garlic we had planted for next year, listening while I explained what Vera had done and why. Milo stood at the edge of each group and answered the technical questions I couldn't, filling in the chemistry and the history with the quiet authority of someone who had watched it work for 40 years. The farmers were not effusive. Farmers rarely are. But they asked good questions, and they took notes, and a few of them came back individually afterward to walk the field again and look at the soil and ask Milo things quietly at the fence line. One afternoon, a man named Tom Verity, who farmed 300 acres of soybeans 2 miles east, came to the cellar entrance and knocked. I climbed out to find him standing there with his hat in his hands. That gesture again, that particular holding of a hat, that means something, looking at the field. "My grandfather farmed with cover crops," he said without preamble. "Stopped when my father took over. Said it wasn't efficient." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about going back to it." "Milo could tell you more about it than I could," I said. "I know. I talked to him." He looked at me. "I wanted to talk to you, too." "Why?" He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the field. "Because you're the one who didn't give up on it," he said finally. "Milo says you've been out here since April. He says you never miss a day." He turned to look at me, and his expression was something I had to take a moment to understand. The particular expression of someone who is revising a previous assessment. "My son is 12, about your brother's age. I want to understand that things worth having require work." He paused. "Would it be all right if I brought him to walk the field?" "Bring him Saturday," I said. The Harvest Festival had been a county tradition for 30 years, held on the second weekend of October at the fairgrounds. This year, Darlene Marsh asked if we would set up a demonstration table, not to sell, but to display what the field had produced and show Vera's journals to anyone who wanted to look. I said yes. Then I went underground and sat with Callo in the warm lamplight and thought about what we were doing, what it meant. "Are you nervous?" Callo asked. He was eating one of the dried apple rings we'd made last week from the old orchard trees, which it turned out still produced apples even though Renata had given up on them. Callo had made 20 pounds of dried apple rings in the dehydrator Milo had lent us and was unreasonably proud of this fact. "A little? Don't be," he said, with the absolute confidence of an 11-year-old who has decided something. "Grandma built something real. Real things don't need to be nervous." I looked at him, my brother, who had followed me into an underground room in April with nothing but a backpack and absolute faith that I knew what I was doing, who had kept a planting journal and developed opinions about soil moisture and made 20 pounds of dried apple rings, and never once asked when we were going back to something that looked like normal. "When did you get so wise?" I asked. He thought about it seriously. "Probably around the time I realized we were going to be okay," he said, which was pretty early on, honestly. The festival was a cold, bright October day, the kind that smells like apples and with smoke and the particular sweetness of things that are ending and being gathered in. The fairgrounds were full, more people than usual. Darlene told me, because the drought had made people think about food in ways they hadn't before, had made something abstract suddenly personal and present. Our table held the journals, the soil test results, photographs Callo had taken with Milo's old camera throughout the growing season, and a display of the preserved food we'd put up from the harvest. The jars in their rows, the labeled and sealed containers, the abundance that had come out of 40 years of a woman paying attention to a piece of ground. People stopped. They read the journals. They asked questions. The woman who had bought the first Brandywine tomatoes came and stood at the table for a long time, looking at Vera's handwriting in the oldest journal, 1983, where young Vera had recorded her first deliberate composting experiment in the Northfield. "She always said she was building something," the woman said, half to herself. "We used to think she was just talking about the garden." "She was talking about the garden," I said. "She just meant it differently than people thought." Darlene gave a short presentation in the afternoon, in the fairground's main tent, about drought resilience and soil organic matter, and the long-term thinking required to build agricultural systems that could survive climate variability. She referenced our field. She referenced Vera's journals. She brought me up to stand beside her, which I had not expected and was not prepared for, and I stood there in front of 200 farmers and county residents and said the only thing I knew how to say. "My grandmother spent 40 years building this for whoever needed it. It turns out that's us, and this year it turns out it's the county, too. I didn't do anything except show up and plant what she prepared. The work was hers." I stopped, then I added, "But I'm going to keep doing the work. That part is mine." There is a particular thing that happens when people who have doubted you change their minds. It is not triumphant. It is quieter than that, more complicated, more human. The woman from the feed store who had laughed about groundhogs came to the farmer's market in November and bought 2 quarts of preserved tomatoes and thanked me without meeting my eyes, which I understood was the best she could manage and accepted accordingly. The farmers who had walked the field that October started coming to Milo with questions about cover crops and composting and the particular practices Vera had used, and Milo answered them with the same quiet patience he had shown me, passing on what he knew, building something that extended beyond our fence line. Tom Verity came back with his son. They spent an afternoon in the field with Callo, who explained the planting journal system with the serious precision of a child explaining something he has decided matters, and Tom Verity watched his son take notes and had an expression on his face that I recognized as a father understanding something important. Renata did not come back. I heard from Milo that she had put the farmhouse on the market in September. I felt something about this that was not quite sadness and not quite relief, more like the closing of a chapter, the turning of a page. The house was bought by a young couple from out of state who wanted a farm. They came to introduce themselves in November, and when I explained about the Northfield and the Cellar, they listened with the open, eager attention of people who had chosen to begin something and are grateful for whatever knowledge already exists about how to do it. "We'll learn from you," the woman said. "Learn from Vera's journals." I told her that's where the real knowledge is. The winter was cold, but not hard. Nothing like the storm that sometimes comes to flatten everything and test what's been built. We lived through it underground, warm and well-stocked, Callo working through a correspondence curriculum that Darlene had helped me set up through the county school office, me reading everything Vera had left about soil and seasons, and the patient work of building something that outlasts you. Milo came twice a week, for dinner usually, sitting at the folding table we'd set up in the main room, and eating whatever I'd cooked from the preserved stores, and talking about everything and nothing. He taught me to play chess. Callo beat him at it by February. In the evenings, I would sometimes take out the key, still on its leather cord, worn smooth from handling now, and hold it in my palm and think about the woman who had worn it for decades, tending a field and filling a cellar and writing journals that nobody was reading yet, building something of faith that someday someone would need it. She had been building it for us. She had been building it for the county in its drought year. She had been building it for Tom Verity's son writing notes in a planting journal, and for the new farmers learning from her records, and for everyone who would plant that field in the years after us. She had been building it for whoever showed up. "Callo," I said one evening. He was annotating the seed catalog Milo had brought over, marking varieties with a system of symbols he had invented for himself. "Do you think we're doing what you wanted?" He considered this seriously, the way he considered everything. Then he looked around the room. The stone walls, the shelves with their jars, the low timber ceiling that had held through 40 winters before we arrived, the lamplight making everything warm and close. "I think she wanted someone to keep building," he said. "I think that's the whole thing. You don't stop when you find it. You keep going." He went back to his catalog. I kept holding the key. He was right. He was absolutely right. I have thought about that conversation many times since. The way he said it. Not with the weight of someone delivering wisdom, but with the mild certainty of someone stating a fact he had already quietly worked out for himself. The way you might say the beans go in the lower shelf or the frost comes earlier in the north field. He was 11 years old, and he understood something that had taken me the better part of a year to learn. Something I am not sure I had fully learned even then, sitting in that lamplight, turning a key over and over my hand. You don't stop when you find it. You keep going. I think what I had been doing, without quite knowing it, was waiting for the moment when I would feel settled, when the work would feel finished, or at least finished enough. When I would stop waking at 3 a.m. and running through the list of what I had missed, what I had not yet understood, what might fail. I had been carrying a low, constant sense that I was still in the interim, that the real life, the one where I knew what I was doing, was still ahead of me somewhere, waiting for me to qualify for it. Callo had never seemed to share this feeling. He woke up each day and did the work of that day. He annotated his catalog. He learned his lessons. He beat Milo at chess and felt no particular need to explain how he had done it. He was already living the life. He had moved in the moment we arrived. I don't know if this is a quality of children or a quality of him specifically. This ability to be where he was without reserving part of himself for some imagined future state of readiness. I suspect it is partly his nature. He was always like that, even before, in the years when our life had been ordinary and I had taken for granted the steadiness of him, the way he planted his feet. But I also think the place helped. The rootedness of it, the way every object in that cellar had been chosen by someone who had thought carefully about what was needed and what would last. You cannot spend a winter in a house like that, surrounded by 40 years of patient decision-making, of someone else's careful love made solid and practical, without starting to absorb something of its quality. The journals helped me most in those months. I had been reading them in order, following Vera through her seasons, but by December I had started moving through them differently, opening the pages at random, reading whatever I found. It felt less like research and more like conversation. She had a dry humor that didn't come through in her record-keeping, but surfaced in the personal sections. She wrote about a neighbor's dog that kept getting into her bean rows with resigned exasperation that made me laugh out loud more than once. She wrote about a season when everything she planted in the North Quarter failed, and she could not figure out why. And the following spring, she found an old buried drainage pipe that had cracked and was pooling water underground. 3 years of bad yield explained by a pipe I didn't know was there, she wrote. The land always has reasons. You just have to stay long enough to learn them. I copied that line into my own notebook. I have it still. She wrote about loneliness. Sometimes, the particular loneliness of someone who has chosen a life that not many people understand, who has watched others look at what she built and see only what it lacked rather than what it was. She did not write about this with bitterness, mostly more with a kind of clear-eyed accounting. Some people see a field, she wrote. Some people see what the field is for. She had known the difference. She had chosen to keep building for the second kind of person, even when they had not arrived yet, even when she had no particular reason to believe they would. That faith strikes me now as one of the more extraordinary things I have encountered. Not a faith that required anything supernatural, just a faith in the simple, unprovable idea that the work you do with your hands and your attention will matter to someone you cannot see yet, that the jar you fill and the seed you plant and the thing you write down will reach forward in time and find someone who needs exactly what you left. She was right about that. I am the evidence. The field was sleeping under its winter mulch, the garlic bulbs we had planted in October already sending down their roots into soil that had been tended for 40 years. That would be tended for 40 more. In spring, we would plant again. I started keeping my own journal that winter, not just the planting records, the yield columns and soil notes. I had been doing that since October. Careful and dutiful, but a real journal, the kind Vera had kept. The kind where you write down what you are thinking as well as what you are doing, where you let the record show that you were a person and not just a pair of hands. I wrote about Callo and his symbols. I wrote about Milo's chess lessons and a particular pleasure of watching Callo dismantle him with quiet politeness. I wrote about the sound the wind made against the cellar door on the bad nights in January, and the way the lamplight looked on the stone walls, and the strange comfort of sleeping underground while the cold moved across the surface of things above us. I wrote about my grandmother, not Vera, my own grandmother, who I had not thought about in years, who had taught me to make preserves in a kitchen that smelled like vinegar and wood smoke, and who had died before I understood what she was teaching me. I wrote about the things I wished I had paid attention to. I wrote about what it is like to come into understanding late, after the person who held it is already gone. I think that is one of the true griefs, not the dramatic kind that announces itself, but the quiet accumulated grief of the things you didn't learn in time, the questions you didn't think to ask, and the strange consolation that comes alongside it, that those things were not only in the person, that they were also in what the person built, in the habits they passed along without calling them lessons, in the quality of attention they modeled without explaining they were modeling anything. My grandmother's preserves are in my hands. I didn't know that until I needed it. Whatever came after that winter, we would figure out the way you figure things out when someone has given you solid ground to stand on, one season at a time, one row at a time, one harvest at a time, until the hole in the earth your grandmother dug becomes a foundation, and the foundation becomes a home, and the home becomes something that outlasts all of you, which is the only kind of thing worth building. If this story found you at a hard moment, if you are someone who is being told that what you have is not enough, that where you are is not worth staying, that the life you're trying to build is smaller or stranger or slower than the life you were supposed to want, I want you to hear this. Someone may have built something for you already. It may be waiting in a field you haven't walked yet, or in a letter you haven't opened, or in the things a person taught you that you only half paid attention to because you were young and believed you had time. The knowledge your grandmother carried, without naming it, the habit of care someone showed you before you had words for what you were watching. The conversation that planted something in you that has not yet broken the surface. You may be standing on a foundation you haven't recognized yet. The ground beneath you may be richer than you know, amended over decades by someone who was thinking of you before you existed. Building the faith that you would show up and understand that the work was for you, not because you were special, because you came. Because you were willing to stay long enough to learn the land's reasons. Start digging. And when you find what's there, when you open the door and see the shelves, when you read the journals and hear the voice of someone who is already quietly on your side, don't stop. Keep building. Build it for whoever shows up next.